The building stood on a quiet street in Baltimore, a red brick row house that had survived half a century of winters and tenants. 3 floors, narrow stairwell, old radiators that hissed like tired snakes every morning. Nothing about it looked unusual. The sidewalk carried the same rhythm as any American neighborhood. A bus stop at the corner, a diner that smelled like bacon grease before sunrise, a liquor store with neon signs buzzing in the window. Inside the building lived a handful of longtime renters, teachers, a postal worker, a retired mechanic. People who paid modest rent because their leases dated back decades. Apartment 2B belonged to a quiet man named Victor. Victor kept regular habits. Left for work at 7, returned at 5, watched baseball with the volume low. His neighbors said he never caused trouble, never missed rent. But there was one detail about the apartment walls. At first it looked like water damage. Thin red streaks running down the pale plaster near the bathroom, like rust bleeding through old pipes. Except the pipes were fine. The streaks appeared again a week later, longer this time, and stranger. Because the lines were not random anymore. They curved, they gathered, and if you stepped back far enough, the stains almost looked like letters forming on the wall. The maintenance request sounded routine. Victor called the building manager on a Tuesday morning, said the bathroom wall was leaking something red again, maybe old plumbing, maybe mold. The manager promised to send someone later that afternoon, but Victor never answered the door. By evening, the manager unlocked the apartment with a spare key. The place smelled damp, like wet plaster after a storm. Victor lay on the kitchen floor, dead. Police said the cause was obvious. A deep stab wound beneath the ribs. No weapon nearby. No sign of forced entry. Just silence. And the walls? Because the red streaks had spread beyond the bathroom now, across the hallway, down the living room plaster. Thick lines of dark crimson liquid sliding slowly downward. At first glance, they looked like blood seeping through the structure itself. But then one officer noticed something strange. The streaks had gathered on the wall above Victor's couch. Not randomly, not like a spill. The liquid had formed curved lines, vertical strokes, a loop at the end. It looked disturbingly deliberate. When the stains finished drying, the shape became clearer. 5 letters across the cracked plaster. Victor. Victor's own name. The case attracted attention fast, not because of the murder alone. Baltimore sees its share of violent crime. Detectives know how those stories usually go. What made this one strange were the walls. Photographs spread through the precinct by morning. The red stains clearly formed Victor's name above the couch. Forensics tested the substance immediately. The answer came back in less than a day. It was not blood, not human, not even animal. The lab identified it as a pigment produced by bacteria, a microbe commonly found in damp bathrooms, sinks, and shower corners. The report included a name most detectives had never heard before: Serratia marcescens. Under certain conditions, the bacteria produce a deep red compound called prodigiosin. It often appears as streaks or slime on wet surfaces. Old buildings see it all the time. Humidity, poor ventilation, old plaster. Perfect habitat. The official conclusion was simple. Victor had been murdered by an unknown attacker. The red stains on the wall were unrelated, just bacteria growing through damp plaster. Coincidence? Case closed on the mystery of the bleeding walls. Or at least, that's what the report said. Marcus worked in a basement lab 3 blocks from the harbor. The building belonged to a small environmental testing company that inspected water systems across the city. Most of his days were quiet. Petri dishes, microscopes, coffee that tasted like burned cardboard. Marcus liked it that way. His job was simple on paper: identify microbes from water samples sent by inspectors, hospitals, or property managers. But Marcus treated every plate like evidence. He labeled everything twice: log time, humidity, temperature. Took photos before touching the sample. Microbes lie, he liked to say, but they always leave patterns. That morning, he was examining a culture taken from a hotel fountain. Harmless algae bloom, routine work. Then his phone buzzed. A friend from the city health department. "Hey, Marcus," the voice said. "You seen that murder case on Charles Street?" Marcus hadn't. The caller sent a photo: a wall, old plaster, dark red streaks forming letters. Victor. Marcus stared at the image, longer than necessary. Yes, the lab report was technically correct. The pigment looked like prodigiosin from Serratia marcescens. But something about the pattern bothered him. Bacteria spread. They stain. They drip. They do not write names. The official report landed on Marcus's desk the next afternoon, not through police channels, through routine paperwork. The landlord of Victor's building had requested a microbial safety assessment. The same bacteria from the case had been reported in several apartments. Possible biohazard contamination. Marcus read the request twice. If confirmed, the building might need evacuation for sanitation. Tenants relocated, units sealed for treatment. It was expensive, but legally possible. Marcus now had two choices. Option 1. Run the standard analysis. Confirm the presence of Serratia and sign the report. Fast, easy. Option 2. Question the sample source connected to an active homicide case. That meant paperwork, calls from lawyers, and possibly the police department asking why a microbiologist was interfering. Scientists rarely enjoy stepping into criminal investigations, but Marcus kept looking at the photo again. The red letters, the curves, the spacing between strokes. Bacteria could spread along moisture channels inside plaster. Gravity could pull pigments downward, but letters required something else. Direction. Marcus sighed, closed the case file, and stood up from the desk. If microbes wrote that name, he said quietly to himself, I want to see the pen. The apartment building smelled like wet dust and radiator steam. Marcus arrived with a small sampling kit and a clipboard. The police tape had already been removed. The landlord met him in the hallway, a tall man named Gerald with expensive shoes and nervous hands. Just confirming the contamination, Gerald said quickly. Health department wants documentation. Marcus nodded and entered Victor's apartment. The place still looked frozen in time. Coffee mug in the sink. Baseball game paused on the television screen, and the wall above the couch. Victor's name remained there, dark red against pale plaster. Marcus approached slowly. At first glance, the lab report was correct. The surface held a thin microbial film. He scraped a sample with a sterile swab and sealed it in a tube. Classic Serratia growth. The pigment prodigiosin gave the streaks their deep blood color. But Marcus noticed something odd immediately. Bacteria usually spread outward in irregular colonies. These lines were narrow, clean, almost like paint dragged across wet plaster. He crouched near the baseboard and shined a small flashlight along the wall surface. Moisture trails became visible under the light. Thin channels inside the plaster where water had seeped downward. Normal in old buildings. But then Marcus saw the strange detail. The moisture channels were straight vertical lines, yet the red stains curved sideways. Sharp turns, loops, angles that ignored gravity completely. Marcus leaned closer to the wall and whispered quietly, "Something moved you." Marcus took 3 samples from Victor's wall before leaving the apartment. One from the letter V, one from the middle of the name, one from a clean area beside it. Back in the lab, he spread the cultures onto fresh agar plates. Classic microbiology routine. Within 20 hours, the colonies appeared exactly as expected. Small, smooth circles glowing with that familiar deep red pigment. Serratia marcescens. No surprise there. But Marcus noticed something else when comparing the samples. The bacteria from the letters grew faster than the control sample taken from the blank plaster. Much faster, almost aggressive. He checked the metadata from the landlord's request again. Several other apartments in the same building had reported red streaks too. Bathrooms mostly, behind sinks, along window frames. Marcus drove back that afternoon and asked to inspect another unit. Apartment 3A belonged to a retired bus driver named Henry. Henry's bathroom ceiling showed faint pink streaks running down the tile grout. The color was lighter, almost diluted. Marcus swabbed the surface and examined the area with his flashlight. The moisture patterns here were normal. Gravity pulling thin lines straight downward. No curves, no shapes. Just bacteria growing wherever the plaster stayed damp. The sample later confirmed it. Same species, same pigment, but ordinary growth. Nothing even close to writing a name. Marcus stared at the lab results that night. Same bacteria. Same building, yet one sample behaved like wild growth, and the other behaved like it had been guided. The idea came from a place Marcus least expected, a laundromat 2 blocks from his apartment. He sat there waiting for the dryer cycle, flipping through printed photos of Victor's wall again. An older man folding shirts glanced over his shoulder. "That looks like one of those miracle walls," the man said casually. Marcus looked up. "Miracle walls?" "Yeah," the man said, shrugging. "My grandma had one. Water stains shaped like the Virgin Mary. People came to take pictures." Marcus smiled politely and returned to the photos, but the comment stuck in his mind. People see patterns everywhere. Faces in clouds, shapes in wood grain, letters in random stains. The brain is very good at connecting dots that were never meant to connect. Marcus studied Victor's wall image again. The letters looked clear, almost too clear. The lines were evenly spaced. The angles consistent. That wasn't the messy randomness of bacteria finding moisture inside plaster. It looked deliberate. He zoomed in on the photo and measured the width of each red stroke using a digital ruler, nearly identical. Marcus leaned back in the plastic chair. "Okay," he murmured. "If someone didn't write the name." He paused. Mo said then something else must have drawn the path first. The next morning, Marcus prepared a simple test. He built a small plaster panel inside a plastic container, old building material, similar to what Victor's apartment used. Then he introduced Serratia marcescens to the damp surface. At room humidity, the bacteria spread normally, random blotches, pink smears, exactly what textbooks described. Next, he tried something different. Marcus took a fine brush and painted invisible lines across the plaster using sterile water mixed with trace nutrients, nothing visible to the eye. Then he sprayed the bacterial solution across the entire surface. 20 hours later, he checked the panel. The bacteria had grown everywhere. Moisture remained. But the densest colonies formed along the invisible nutrient paths. Thin red lines appeared where the brush had touched the plaster. Marcus leaned closer to the container. The lines were rough, but recognizable. He tried the test again. This time, he wrote a letter on the plaster using the nutrient mixture. Just one variable changed. After incubation, the bacteria followed that path with remarkable accuracy. The pigment intensified along the invisible track. From across the lab bench, the result looked like writing. Marcus stared at the glowing red letter forming on the panel. Not perfect, but close enough. Close enough to fool someone looking at a damp wall. He slowly exhaled and whispered to the empty room. So bacteria didn't write the message. He tapped the plastic container lightly. Someone else drew the roadmap. Marcus invited 2 people to the lab the next day. One detective from the homicide unit and a public health inspector who had signed the original bacteria report. They stood around the workbench while Marcus uncovered a plastic container holding his plaster panel. Inside it, bright red letters had appeared overnight. The detective frowned. "You wrote that with bacteria?" Marcus shook his head. "No," he said. "I wrote it with food." He pointed to the panel. Serratia marcescens is a very common bacterium. It lives in damp places like sinks, showers, and old plaster, but it doesn't grow evenly everywhere. He tapped the container gently. Bacteria follow nutrients the same way ants follow sugar. Marcus explained the pigment first. Prodigiosin, a natural red compound produced when the bacteria reach high density. That was why bathrooms sometimes looked like they were bleeding pink slime. But the important part was growth behavior. Bacteria move toward microscopic gradients of moisture and nutrients. If someone paints a thin, invisible trail of nutrients across a surface, the microbes will concentrate there. The rest of the wall grows lightly, but along that trail, the colony becomes dense enough to produce bright pigment. Marcus opened the container and showed them 2 panels, one with random stains, one with a clear red word. Both were sprayed with the same bacteria, he said. "The difference is the path I painted first." The detective looked at the letters slowly forming on the plaster. "Meaning Victor's wall?" Marcus nodded. It was prepared before the bacteria ever grew. Now the timeline began to make sense. Marcus pulled up photos of Victor's apartment and placed them on the table. The wall wasn't writing anything, he said. It was developing, like a photograph appearing in a dark room. First step, someone applied a nutrient solution onto the damp plaster, thin lines forming Victor's name, invisible once it dried. Second step, the wall already contained Serratia marcescens. The building was old and humid, perfect conditions for growth. When moisture returned to the plaster, the bacteria woke up. They spread across the surface slowly, but along the nutrient paths, growth exploded. Dense colonies formed, and once the bacterial population reached a certain level, they began producing prodigiosin. The red pigment seeped outward and downward through the plaster surface. Within a day or 2, the invisible lines turned into crimson streaks, letters appearing gradually on the wall. Marcus tapped one photo. The timing matters. Victor had called maintenance about the red streaks earlier that week. That meant the bacterial bloom had already begun, which meant the nutrient lines had been placed days before the murder. Someone expected those letters to appear. Marcus leaned back in his chair. They were waiting for the wall to finish the message. The detective studied the case file again. One name appeared repeatedly across the paperwork. Gerald, the landlord. Marcus flipped to the housing records next. Most tenants in the building had lived there for years. Rent-controlled leases from the early 90s. Some units paying less than half of modern market rates. Then Marcus opened the environmental request Gerald had submitted. Biohazard contamination. Multiple units. Possible evacuation. If the building were declared unsafe, the tenants could be forced to leave during remediation, and once rent-controlled apartments sit empty, landlords rarely bring the old contracts back. The detective connected the rest quickly. Gerald didn't need bacteria to kill Victor, but he needed fear. A building where walls appeared to bleed red names. A story that spread through tenants fast. A health hazard investigation to justify clearing the building. Marcus pointed to the lab data again. The bacteria were already in the walls, he said. All he had to do was guide them. Invisible nutrient lines. Humidity from leaking pipes, and patience while the microbes finished the performance. The detective closed the file slowly, so the landlord tried to manufacture a supernatural panic. Marcus nodded, and Victor probably figured it out. The more detectives looked into Gerald's properties, the stranger the pattern became. The Baltimore building was not his only one. He owned 4 small apartment houses across the city, all built before 1970, all filled with long-term tenants paying controlled rent. And in 2 of those buildings, residents had recently filed the same complaint. Red streaks appearing on damp walls, bathroom tiles turning pink, strange stains running through plaster. One tenant in East Baltimore had even posted photos online, calling it a bleeding wall. Marcus reviewed the lab reports from those addresses. Same bacterium, Serratia marcescens. Same pigment, prodigiosin. But the pattern was different from Victor's apartment. Those stains looked natural, messy, random. Exactly how bacteria normally grow. Victor's wall was the only one that spelled something. Marcus stared at the housing timeline again. Gerald had begun filing hazard inspection requests shortly after those complaints appeared. If inspectors confirmed microbial contamination, entire units could be vacated temporarily. Repairs, mold removal, structural drying, and once tenants moved out, new leases could be written, market prices instead of protected rent. Victor had lived in that building the longest, 27 years, and according to one neighbor, he had been arguing with Gerald about something days before the murder. The confrontation happened inside a small conference room at the police station. Gerald arrived with a lawyer and the same careful smile he wore in the apartment hallway. Marcus placed 2 plaster panels on the table, one with random bacterial stains, one with a bright red name growing across the surface. Gerald watched quietly. Marcus explained the experiment step by step. Nutrient trails, moisture channels, bacterial concentration. The pigment appearing only where the colony density became high enough. Then Marcus slid a printed photograph across the table. Victor's wall, the red name above the couch. Next came another sheet. A chemical analysis of residue found in Gerald's maintenance closet. The same nutrient mixture Marcus had used in the lab. Sugars, amino acids, simple microbial feed. Marcus folded his hands. Someone painted Victor's name on that wall days before he died. Gerald's lawyer leaned forward. "Are you accusing my client of writing it?" Marcus shrugged slightly. "I'm saying bacteria can follow a path, but they can't hold a paintbrush." Gerald finally spoke, calm, flat. "Old buildings grow strange things," he said. No confession, just silence filling the room. Weeks later, the building on Charles Street looked ordinary again. The stains had faded after the walls dried and were repainted. New tenants would never know the story, but the science remained simple. Serratia marcescens lives almost everywhere. Moisture lingers, bathrooms, kitchens, damp plaster. Under the right conditions, it produces prodigiosin, a deep red pigment that can look disturbingly like blood. Most of the time it forms random streaks and slimy patches. But bacteria follow chemistry. Give them a trail of nutrients, and they will gather there. Dense colonies grow, pigment appears. And to anyone standing across the room, the result can look like writing, a message slowly developing on the wall. Marcus kept the experiment panel in his lab as a reminder, because the microbes never lied. They simply followed the path someone left for them. And that leaves one strange question behind. If a few invisible drops of nutrients can guide millions of bacteria, how many other mysterious signs on old walls might simply be science waiting to grow? He simply watches the screen and never once denies the pattern. If you stand in the Cleveland Vault today, the shelves look perfectly ordinary, rows of gold bars resting under quiet fluorescent lights. The system has been upgraded. The new lamps run at high-frequency drivers, thousands of cycles per second. No visible flicker, no slow pulsing. Auditors count the stacks again. 10 bars per shelf, exactly 10. But the video from that Thursday morning still exists in the archive. Watch it carefully, and something strange happens. One bar disappears. Another appears across the aisle. No sliding, no falling. Just a quiet shift that never actually occurred. Physics didn't move the gold. The human brain moved the scene instead. Because vision is not a camera. It's a prediction machine constantly filling gaps between flashes of information. When light flickers slowly enough, those gaps grow large. Large enough for objects to jump. Large enough for a missing bar to hide inside a perfect-looking stack. Daniel likes to end his report with one sentence. A question he asks every investigator who watches the footage. Look again at the shelves. The gold seems to move. But ask yourself something simple. Did it really move? Or did you just see it happen?